Picture killing a large animal, more meat than one family could possibly eat in a single day. No refrigerator, no freezer, not even ice. Most of the year, in most parts of the world, within days, without doing anything about it, that entire animal would rot, uneaten, wasted, gone. And yet humans didn't just lose most of their food to spoilage for hundreds of thousands of years. They built an entire hidden science around stopping it, long before anyone understood a single thing about bacteria. So how did humans actually keep food edible, sometimes for months at a time, without any form of mechanical cooling at all? The answer starts with a question almost nobody asks. What actually makes food go bad in the first place? Spoilage. Bacteria, mold, and enzymes breaking food down, usually accelerated by exactly two things: moisture and warmth. And that single fact, discovered entirely through trial and error, became the foundation for almost every food preservation method humans would ever invent. Remove the moisture, or remove the warmth. Every solution in this story is really just a different way of attacking one of those two things. And the very first method humans landed on attacked moisture directly. Drying meat, fish, and fruit, cut into thin strips or slices and left exposed to sun, wind, or a low fire, lose most of their internal water content. Without that moisture, the bacteria and mold responsible for decay simply can't survive. What's left behind is lightweight, incredibly stable, and can last for months instead of days. This is where an early version of something you've probably eaten shows up. Dried, pounded strips of meat, sometimes preserved further with rendered fat and dried berries mixed in, became a survival staple across multiple cultures independently, most famously pemmican, developed by indigenous peoples across North America, a dense, calorie-packed food that could be carried for weeks without spoiling, engineered centuries before anyone used the word nutrition. But drying alone had a limit. It worked well in dry, sunny, or windy climates. In humid environments, meat left out to dry didn't dehydrate fast enough. It rotted first. So a second method developed, one that attacked spoilage from a completely different angle. Smoke. Meat and fish hung over a low, steady fire absorbed heat and chemical compounds from the smoke itself, drying the food while simultaneously coating it in natural antibacterial compounds. Smoking didn't just preserve food, it created flavor as a side effect, which is exactly why smoked meat and fish are still popular today, thousands of years after the practical need for it in many households has disappeared. And this is where the story splits into a direction almost nobody expects. Because a completely different civilization, with zero contact with the cultures using smoke or sun drying, arrived at a third method entirely. Salt. Salt physically pulls moisture out of food through a process called osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria simply cannot survive. Salted meat and fish appear independently across ancient Egypt, China, and Northern Europe, each culture discovering, entirely on its own, that packing food in salt could keep it edible for months. Salt became so valuable in some of these societies that it functioned almost like currency. Roman soldiers were, according to some historical accounts, partially paid in salt, which is actually where the word salary originally comes from, salt being worth literally as much as the ability to preserve your food supply through an entire winter. Three completely different regions, three completely different climates, all discovering that pulling water out of food, whether through sun, smoke, or salt, was the key to stopping it from rotting. But drying, smoking, and salting only solved half the puzzle. There was a second entire category of preservation, one that didn't remove moisture at all. It used it. Fermentation. This is genuinely strange when you think about it. Instead of stopping bacteria from growing, fermentation deliberately introduces specific, beneficial bacteria or fungi into food, ones that outcompete the harmful bacteria responsible for spoilage, while also producing acid or alcohol that makes the environment hostile to anything dangerous. In East Asia, vegetables packed in salt and left to ferment naturally became kimchi and various pickled preparations, some traced back thousands of years, capable of lasting through an entire winter buried underground in sealed clay jars. In Europe, a nearly identical process using cabbage produced sauerkraut, discovered independently, using the exact same core bacterial science, centuries before anyone understood what a bacterium even was. Milk, another naturally short-lived food, underwent its own version of this same trick. Left to ferment under the right conditions, milk transforms into yogurt or cheese, both of which last dramatically longer than fresh milk ever could, an ancient accident that different pastoral cultures across Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia all stumbled into on their own. Humans hadn't just learned to slow down decay. In fermentation, they'd learned to deliberately hijack it, turning the exact same biological process that ruins food into the very thing that saves it. But everything so far dealt with meat, fish, dairy, and vegetables individually. There was still a bigger problem waiting, an entire harvest's worth of grain, needing to last through months where nothing new could be grown at all. This is where storage itself, not just preservation technique, became critical. Grain silos and sealed underground pits, lined with clay, stone, or woven baskets coated in mud, protected harvested grain from moisture, pests, and temperature swings for months at a time. Archaeological sites across the ancient Middle East show enormous storage pits, some capable of holding grain for an entire community, evidence that food storage wasn't just a household task, it was a foundational piece of early civilization itself. Without reliable long-term grain storage, cities, with populations that couldn't hunt or farm daily for themselves, likely couldn't have existed at all. Meanwhile, an entirely different strategy was developing for something drying, smoking, and salting couldn't easily handle: fresh produce and dairy that needed to stay genuinely cold, not just dry. The root cellar, digging storage space directly into the ground, took advantage of something remarkably consistent. Underground temperatures stay significantly cooler and more stable than surface air, especially during summer months. Root vegetables, packed in dry sand or straw inside these cellars, could last for months, insulated from both heat and sudden temperature swings by the earth surrounding them on every side. But some cultures push this idea even further, into something that sounds almost impossible without modern technology: ice, stored deliberately to last through summer. In ancient Persia, a genuinely remarkable structure called the Yakshul, a large domed, thick-walled building, used evaporative cooling and clever airflow design to actually freeze water and store ice. In a desert climate, without any mechanical refrigeration whatsoever, ice harvested or created during cooler months could remain frozen inside these structures well into the heat of summer, used to preserve food and even make chilled desserts. In one of the hottest regions on the planet, in colder regions of Europe, North America, and Scandinavia, a simpler but related idea took hold: the ice house. Blocks of ice, cut directly from frozen lakes and rivers during winter, were packed tightly in sawdust or straw inside insulated underground or semi-underground structures. Sawdust, an otherwise useless waste product from lumber mills, turned out to be an excellent insulator. An ice pack this way could genuinely last through an entire summer, sometimes even longer. And this eventually grew into something almost nobody expects: an actual global industry, built entirely around frozen water. In the 1800s, a businessman named Frederick Tudor, later nicknamed the Ice King, built a genuine international trade empire around harvesting ice from frozen New England lakes and shipping it, packed in sawdust, on wooden ships, to warm climates as far away as the Caribbean and even India. It sounds almost absurd, shipping frozen lake water across entire oceans, and much of it did melt in transit, but enough survived the journey to make it wildly profitable, creating one of the strangest, most genuinely global commodities in the history of food preservation, decades before mechanical refrigeration existed anywhere. By the mid to late 1800s, actual mechanical refrigeration began appearing, first in industrial settings like breweries and meatpacking plants, using compressors and refrigerants to create cold artificially instead of relying on harvested winter ice. This eventually shrank down, decade by decade, into the household refrigerator, a machine that finally did, automatically and continuously, what root cellars, ice houses, and yakshuls had been doing manually for centuries. Stop and compare these two realities for a second. An early human, salting strips of meat by hand, burying grain in a sealed clay-lined pit, or carefully packing winter ice into sawdust, hoping it would survive long enough to matter months later in the heat of summer. Today, you open a door, and cold air is simply there, instantly, continuously, with a compressor quietly running somewhere you never even think about. The core problem never actually changed across that entire span of time: food decays, and humans needed to buy themselves time against it. What changed was every single method built to do that: sun and wind pulling out moisture, smoke coating food and natural preservation, salt drawing water out through pure chemistry, fermentation turning decay into a defense, the earth itself used as a natural refrigerator, and finally, frozen lakes shipped across oceans just to keep something cold a little longer. Maybe that's the real thread running through this story. Long before anyone understood bacteria, or chemistry, or refrigeration as a science, humans had already quietly figured out almost every core principle behind keeping food safe, using nothing but sun, smoke, salt, ice, and the ground beneath their feet. If you found it interesting how humans solve something this essential using nothing but the natural world around them, watch the next video, where we trace how humans went from carrying water by hand to indoor plumbing. There's a civilization, over 4,000 years old, that had something inside their homes you'd genuinely be surprised to find. Something with drainage, something connected to underground channels, something that, in a few specific ways, worked a little like the toilet in your own bathroom right now. Most people assume flushing toilets are a distinctly modern invention. They're wrong, and the real story of how humans handled this single, universal problem, one every single person on Earth deals with every single day, is far stranger and far older than almost anyone expects. So how did ancient humans actually go to the bathroom for thousands of years, before anything resembling a modern toilet existed? The answer starts somewhere almost nobody thinks to look: the ground itself. For the earliest humans, there was no system at all. You simply moved away from where you slept and ate, and used open ground, ideally somewhere downwind and away from a water source. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but that basic instinct, distance your waste from your food and water, is actually the seed of every single sanitation system that came after it. But as humans stopped moving constantly and began settling into permanent villages, that simple instinct stopped working. You couldn't just walk somewhere else forever. The same patch of ground was now home, every single day, for years at a time, and that created a serious, invisible danger. Human waste left near living spaces and water sources spreads disease, quietly, without anyone understanding why people kept getting sick. The first real solution was almost primitive by comparison to what came later, but it worked. The pit latrine, a simple hole dug into the ground, sometimes lined with stone, sometimes left bare, used specifically to contain and separate waste from daily life. Simple, effective, and in many parts of the world, still in use today, virtually unchanged after thousands of years. But a single household pit only solved part of the problem. What happens when hundreds, or thousands, of people live crowded together in one place? This is where the story takes its first genuinely surprising turn. Roughly 4,000 years ago, in the cities of the Indus Valley Civilization, in what's now Pakistan and northwest India, archaeologists have uncovered something remarkable. Individual homes with built-in latrines, connected through brick-lined drains running beneath the streets themselves, into a citywide sewage network. Some of these homes even show evidence of seated or squatting toilet fixtures, positioned directly over these drainage channels. This wasn't a lucky accident. This was deliberate civic engineering, citywide sanitation infrastructure, built thousands of years before Rome, thousands of years before anyone in Europe would build anything comparable. And here's the detail that makes this genuinely strange. For centuries afterward, in many other parts of the world, sanitation actually got worse, not better, before it got better again. In ancient Rome, the approach shifted in a completely different direction, from private convenience toward public, communal infrastructure. Roman cities built large public latrines, long stone benches with evenly spaced holes, where dozens of people sat, side by side, in the same room, at the same time, with no dividers between them at all. It was social. It sounds almost unbelievable by modern standards, but in Roman culture, this wasn't shameful or awkward. It was social. People talked, conducted business, and caught up on gossip while using these communal facilities together. And there's one detail that tends to genuinely surprise people. Instead of paper, Romans commonly used a shared tool called a tricorium, a sponge attached to a stick, kept in a small trough of water or vinegar position in front of the seating, used, rinsed, and left for the next person. Shared, not disposable. An entire bathroom culture built around communal tools most people today would find genuinely uncomfortable to even imagine. Underneath these Roman latrines ran something even more impressive: the Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest large-scale sewer systems, originally built to drain marshland, later expanded to carry waste and runoff out of the city entirely. Parts of this system, remarkably, are still functioning underneath modern Rome over 2,000 years later. So if sophisticated drainage and sewage systems already existed in the Indus Valley and in Rome, why did European sanitation seem to collapse backward for centuries afterward? The answer lies in what happened after these empires fell. As Roman infrastructure crumbled across medieval Europe, so did centralized sanitation knowledge. Most medieval towns had no citywide sewer system at all. Instead, waste management became fragmented, individual, and, frankly, far messier. In medieval castles and homes, a structure called the garderobe became common, a small stone alcove built into an outer wall, essentially a toilet seat positioned directly over open air, allowing waste to fall straight down into a moat, a pit below, or sometimes directly into a river running past the building. In densely packed medieval cities, without anything like that built-in structure, ordinary households relied on chamber pots, simple containers kept indoors overnight, then emptied each morning, often straight out of an upper window into the street below. This practice was common enough that it created its own piece of language. In parts of France and Scotland, people shouted a warning before emptying a chamber pot into the street: "Guard as low," meaning watch out for the water, eventually shortened over time into the modern English word we still use today, loo. Waste in the streets. Waste in open gutters running down the center of roads. For centuries, this was simply how many major European cities functioned, a genuine, visible regression from sanitation systems that had already existed, in some cases, thousands of years earlier, elsewhere in the world. But while Europe was struggling through open gutters and thrown chamber pots, a completely different, remarkably sophisticated system was developing on the other side of the world, one built not around disposal, but around value. In parts of East Asia, particularly in Japan and China, human waste wasn't treated as pure waste at all. It was treated as a resource. Human waste, collected systematically from homes and outhouses, became a genuinely valuable commodity, sold and transported specifically to be used as fertilizer on nearby farmland. In Edo period Japan, this collection process was organized enough that waste rights from certain buildings were bought, sold, and even fought over, an entire structured economy built around something most other cultures were simply trying to get rid of as fast as possible. This wasn't a primitive workaround. It was arguably more sustainable than most European cities managed for centuries afterward, human waste completing an actual agricultural cycle instead of contaminating rivers and streets. Two civilizations, tackling the exact same universal problem, arriving at almost opposite philosophies, one throwing waste away as fast as possible, often carelessly, the other treating it as something worth carefully preserving and selling. Back in Europe, this fragmented, messy system continued for centuries, largely unaddressed, until a crisis so severe it couldn't be ignored any longer finally forced real change. In the summer of 1858, London experienced something that became known, quite literally, as the Great Stink. Decades of raw sewage flowing directly into the River Thames, combined with an unusually hot summer, created an odor so overwhelming that it reportedly disrupted government proceedings at the Houses of Parliament itself, located directly along the river. For the first time, this wasn't an abstract public health concern affecting the poor and crowded slums. It was affecting the people directly in charge of the city. And that, more than any previous warning, finally triggered real action. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette was tasked with designing an entirely new sewer system for London, an enormous network of underground brick tunnels designed to intercept waste before it ever reached the Thames, redirecting it far downstream instead. This system, remarkably, is still partially in use today, over 150 years later, a direct engineering response to a crisis that had, in one form or another, been building for centuries. Around this same general period, the pieces of the modern flush toilet itself were slowly coming together, a valve-based flushing mechanism, later refined into the S-bend and U-bend trap designs still used in plumbing today, specifically engineered to hold a small amount of water inside the pipe at all times, blocking sewer gas and odor from rising back up into the home. This single design detail, deceptively simple, quietly solved a problem that had made indoor toilets genuinely unpleasant for centuries beforehand. From here, the pieces move quickly toward what you'd actually recognize: ceramic bowls, reliable flushing mechanisms, connection to citywide sewage treatment systems that, for the first time, actually treated waste before releasing it back into rivers and waterways, instead of simply moving the problem somewhere else downstream. Stop and compare these two realities for a second. An ancient person in the Indus Valley, using a built-in drain connected beneath their own home. A Roman citizen, sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers on a communal stone bench, sharing a sponge on a stick. A medieval city dweller, shouting a warning before emptying a pot straight out a window into the street below. Today, you walk into a private room, alone, and everything simply disappears with a single, quiet action. No smell, no shared tools, no shouted warning to anyone passing by outside. The core problem never actually changed across that entire span of time. Human waste has to go somewhere, safely, away from the people living nearby. What changed was every layer humans built around solving that: distance and open ground, a simple dug pit, citywide drainage engineering thousands of years ahead of its time, communal public facilities, private alcoves built into castle walls, an entire farming economy built around collection instead of disposal, and finally, a sealed water trap quietly doing, automatically, what centuries of trial and error never quite managed on their own. Maybe that's the real thread running through this story. One of the most universal, most unavoidable human experiences, something every single person on this planet does every single day without a second thought, took thousands of years, multiple entirely separate civilizations, and one genuinely unbearable summer in London, to finally get right. If you found it interesting how humans solve something this basic in so many wildly different ways across the world, somewhere in the Egyptian desert sits a block of stone weighing as much as 10 elephants. No engine lifted it, no crane carried it, no truck hauled it across the sand, and yet it rests perfectly stacked, over 100 meters above the ground, part of a structure that has already outlived every empire built after it. So here's the question worth sitting with for a moment. How did people with no metal machines, no electricity, and not even the wheel in any usable form for this kind of job, manage to move stones heavier than a modern shipping container and stack them with a precision that still confuses engineers today? And even stranger, how did they do this not just in Egypt, but on remote islands, in European fields, in South American mountains, all without ever talking to each other? To really understand this, we need to rewind further than most people expect. Long before pyramids or standing stones, early humans lived in small groups where building meant piling a few rocks over a grave, or stacking stones into a low windbreak beside a shelter. The size of anything they built was limited by the size of what a few pairs of arms could carry. If a rock was too heavy to lift, it simply stayed exactly where it had always been. For most of human history, ambition was capped by muscle. But at some point, someone had an idea that quietly changed the future of construction forever. What if you didn't try to lift the stone at all? What if, instead, you dragged it? This was the very first breakthrough, deceptively simple, almost boring on the surface, but genuinely revolutionary. Builders realized that a heavy object slides far more easily than it lifts. So they began cutting blocks directly from stone quarries, wrapping them in ropes twisted from plant fibers, and pulling. Not one or two people, but dozens, sometimes hundreds, working in rhythm, chanting together to stay synchronized, dragging the stone forward inch by inch across open ground. It worked, but it came with a punishing problem: friction. Dragging a multi-ton block across dry sand or rocky terrain felt like dragging it through thick mud. Ropes snapped under the strain. Workers collapsed from heat and exhaustion. Progress crawled forward in meters per day, not kilometers. If ancient civilizations wanted to build anything on a massive scale, dragging alone was never going to be enough. Something had to change. And what came next might be one of the cleverest low-tech solutions in engineering history, so pay attention, because this one is almost too simple to believe. Builders started placing wooden sledges beneath the stones, and then pouring water directly onto the sand just ahead of the sledge's path. That sounds strange until you understand the physics behind it. Wet sand is actually firmer and offers less resistance than dry sand, because water binds the loose grains together into a more solid surface. Ancient Egyptian tomb paintings actually show exactly this. Workers pouring liquid in front of a massive sledge being hauled by dozens of men, and for a long time, historians assumed this was purely ceremonial. It wasn't. Later experiments confirmed that wetting the sand in front of a sledge could cut the required pulling force by close to half. So now the stones were moving faster across flat ground. But here's the next wall they hit. Moving a stone horizontally is one puzzle. Lifting that same stone 30, 50, even over 100 meters straight into the sky is an entirely different nightmare, and this is where the real ingenuity begins to show. The most widely supported explanation for massive vertical structures like the Great Pyramid involves something surprisingly low-tech: ramps. Not a single steep incline, but long, gradually sloping paths built from packed rubble, mud brick, and debris, constructed alongside the structure as it grew taller layer by layer. Workers dragged the stone blocks up these gentle slopes using the same sledge and water method, and as each new tier of the structure was completed, the ramp itself was extended and raised to keep pace. It was slow, it was grueling, but it converted an impossible vertical lift into a long, walkable slope, because moving something up a gentle incline requires only a fraction of the force needed to hoist it straight up. Of course, ramps created a brand new problem of their own. The taller the structure grew, the longer and steeper the ramp needed to become, which meant exponentially more material, more labor hours, and more risk of collapse. So builders adapted again. Some evidence points towards spiral ramps that wound around the outside of the structure like a staircase, saving valuable space on the ground while still preserving that same manageable slope all the way to the summit. Other theories suggest internal ramps built directly into the body of the structure itself, hidden from view and only discovered by modern scanning technology centuries later. And ramps and sledges were far from the only tricks in the ancient toolbox. Builders also relied heavily on the lever, one of the simplest machines in existence, yet astonishingly powerful. By wedging a long wooden beam under one edge of a stone and pivoting it over a smaller rock or block acting as a fulcrum, a handful of workers could lift one edge of a multi-ton stone just high enough to slide another support underneath. Repeat that motion patiently enough times, from every side, and you could gradually walk an enormous block upward, layer of support by layer of support, without ever needing a crane. This is exactly where things get genuinely fascinating, because civilizations with zero contact with each other were solving this same core problem in strikingly similar, yet independently invented ways. On Easter Island, the massive stone statues called the Moai, some weighing more than 80 tons, were transported across miles of uneven terrain with no wheels and no ramps at all. For decades, archaeologists were completely stumped until researchers tested something based on local oral tradition. They attached ropes to either side of an upright statue and rocked it side to side, essentially walking it forward the same way you'd wrestle a heavy refrigerator across a kitchen floor without lifting it. It worked. The statues quite literally walked to their final resting places, one rocking step at a time. Meanwhile, at Stonehenge in England, builders faced a completely different kind of challenge. Some of the massive bluestones used in the monument weren't even sourced locally. They had to be transported over 100 miles from Wales, likely using a combination of wooden sledges, log rollers acting almost like primitive ball bearings, and river transport by raft along waterways. Once those stones finally arrived, lifting the horizontal slabs, called lintels, on top of the vertical standing stones required earthen ramps, simple lever systems, wooden platforms, and teams of workers pulling ropes threaded through timber frameworks, essentially assembling a temporary wooden crane built from nothing but logs and rope. And the list doesn't stop there. In South America, at sites like Pumapunku and Sacsayhuaman, builders shaped stones so massive and cut them so precisely that some blocks fit together without any mortar at all. The joints are so tight that even today, a knife blade cannot slip between them. This level of precision likely came from a slow, patient process of repeatedly test-fitting stones, grinding down high points, and retesting, over and over, sometimes taking years to perfect the fit of a single wall. At Baalbek in modern-day Lebanon, one single stone block in the foundation, nicknamed the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighs an almost unbelievable 1,000 tons, and yet it was somehow quarried, moved, and nearly positioned using nothing but timber sledges, ropes, and raw, coordinated manpower. To this day, engineers studying the site still debate exactly how a stone of that scale was maneuvered even a short distance without modern equipment. What all of these sites reveal, once you really study them side by side, is that no single civilization had one magic tool. What they all had was patience, deep cooperation, and a genius for combining simple ideas, ropes, levers, ramps, water, timber, and thousands of coordinated human hands, into systems capable of achieving things no individual tool could ever accomplish alone. And it's worth pausing here to really sit with what that means. None of this was luck. Every ramp angle, every rope thickness, every rhythm of hundreds of workers pulling in perfect unison was the product of trial and error passed down and refined across generations, until the entire process became something close to an unwritten science. Many historians actually argue that organizing the labor was harder than solving the physics. Feeding, housing, and coordinating thousands of workers for years, sometimes decades, required a level of logistical and administrative planning that rivals any large modern construction project you could name today. Now picture building that exact same structure today. A modern crane can lift a multi-ton block hundreds of feet into the air within minutes, guided by hydraulics and steel cables strong enough to support the weight of an entire house. A single bulldozer could flatten in one afternoon what ancient ramps took months to construct. GPS and laser levels can align a modern building with millimeter precision, something ancient builders achieved using nothing but the position of the stars, the angle of the sun, and an extraordinary trained eye for detail. And here's the twist that should genuinely humble us. Some of these ancient structures remain aligned with astronomical events, sunrises, solstices, specific star positions, more precisely than many buildings constructed with today's modern tools. Somehow, without satellites, computers, or laser measurement, ancient builders mapped the sky and the ground together with such accuracy that thousands of years later, the sun still rises through the exact same gap between the exact same stones, on the exact same day, every single year. So when you ask how ancient humans built giant stone monuments without machines, the honest answer is that they didn't lack machines at all. They simply built entirely different ones. A rope, a lever, a ramp, a sledge, and a few hundred perfectly coordinated hands were their machines. What they lacked in horsepower, they made up for with patience, teamwork, and a hard-earned understanding of physics that came not from any textbook, but from generations of watching stone, water, wood, and rope, and slowly learning exactly how each one behaved under pressure. And maybe that's the real lesson hiding underneath all of this stone. We like to believe progress is purely about better tools, but some of the biggest achievements in human history came from something far simpler than any machine: ordinary people working together, patiently, towards something none of them could ever lift alone. Somewhere in the ancient world, a farmer wakes up in the dark, with no idea what time it is. No clock on the wall, no phone to check, not even a number to describe the moment he's living in. And yet he still has to know roughly when to plant, when to pray, when to meet others, and when to sleep. So how did ancient humans actually track time, hour by hour, day by day, without a single clock anywhere on Earth? Farmers needed to know when to plant before a season slipped away. Traders needed to agree on a shared moment to meet. Priests needed exact timing for rituals that couldn't simply happen whenever anyone felt like it. Without a shared way to measure time, none of that coordination was even possible. The very first clock humans ever used wasn't built. It was already hanging in the sky. The sun's position told a rough story on its own. Low and orange at dawn, high and sharp at midday, long shadowed again by evening. But position alone wasn't precise enough. Humans needed something that could actually measure the sun's movement, not just glance at it. So they built the simplest possible tool. A single stick, planted upright in the ground. As the sun moved across the sky, the stick's shadow swept slowly around it, shortening toward noon and stretching out again by evening. This simple shadow stick, called a gnomon, became humanity's first real timekeeping device. In Egypt, this idea grew into something enormous. Giant stone obelisks were built specifically to cast long, trackable shadows across entire public squares. Egyptian timekeepers also built smaller, portable shadow clocks, marked with hour lines, that could be repositioned as the sun rose higher through the day. In Babylon, a priest and astronomer named Berossus is credited with refining a hemispherical version of the sundial, a carved bowl shape that tracked the sun's path with far more consistent accuracy across the entire year, not just around noon. This eventually evolved into the sundial, a flat marked surface with a raised edge, where a single shadow could be read almost like a clock face. Some sundials even became small enough to carry. Wealthy Romans owned pocket-sized sundials, portable enough to check the hour while traveling between cities. But some ancient structures weren't built to track hours at all. They were built to track something much bigger, the turning of entire years. At sites like Stonehenge in England, certain stones align precisely with the sunrise on the summer solstice, marking the single longest day of the year with remarkable accuracy. Similar solar alignments appear in ancient structures built independently across the world, from Mesoamerica to ancient Egypt, each one a kind of massive, motionless calendar. Long before anyone could measure a single hour precisely, humans had already figured out how to measure an entire year, just by watching where the sun chose to rise. In Mesoamerica, the Maya pushed this idea even further, tracking celestial cycles precisely enough to build an extraordinarily accurate long-term calendar system, capable of tracking dates across thousands of years. Priests and astronomers recorded the movement of the sun, moon, and even the planet Venus, weaving those cycles into religious ceremonies, agricultural planning, and recorded history all at once. Two civilizations, on opposite sides of the planet, both realized the same thing, that tracking the sky wasn't just useful for the next hour. It could organize an entire society. But sundials had one obvious, unavoidable flaw. The moment the sun disappeared, whether behind clouds or below the horizon, the entire device became completely useless. No shadow meant no time, and roughly half of every single day, the night half, had no sun at all. So ancient humans looked for their next clock somewhere else entirely. Straight up, into the night sky itself. Egyptian priests developed detailed star charts, tracking specific groups of stars called decans as they rose one after another through the night. By watching which decan had just risen, trained observers could estimate roughly which hour of the night it actually was. It wasn't simple. It required years of training and a genuinely precise memory of the sky's slow nightly rotation. But for temple priests responsible for exact nightly rituals, this star-based system was, for a long time, the only real option available. Egyptian astronomers even built a dedicated tool for this exact purpose, called a merkit, a simple sighting instrument used alongside a plumb line to measure precisely when certain stars crossed a fixed point in the sky. Two priests, working together with two merkits, could line up a precise north-south sight line and time a star's crossing almost like a stopwatch made entirely of string and stone. This wasn't just ceremony either. In Egypt, the yearly reappearance of a single star, Sirius, on the horizon reliably predicted the Nile's flooding season, tying precise star watching directly to the survival of an entire harvest. Get that timing wrong, and an entire season of crops could fail. Get it right, and an entire civilization could plan its year around it. Eventually, humans realized the sun and stars weren't the only things that moved at a steady, predictable pace. Water did too. The water clock, known as a clepsydra, used a container with a small hole, letting water drip out at a roughly constant rate into a second marked container below. As the water level rose or fell, marked lines on the container let someone read off roughly how much time had passed. This one invention solved something sundials never could. It worked at night, indoors, and even on a completely cloudy day. Water clocks appeared independently in Egypt, Babylon, Greece, and China, each culture arriving at nearly the same idea without ever meeting each other. In Greek courtrooms, water clocks were even used to time how long a speaker was allowed to talk, timing justice itself, one drop at a time. Around the 3rd century BCE, Greek inventor Ctesibius improved the design dramatically, adding a floating dial connected to gears, so the water clock could display time almost automatically, without anyone needing to read shifting water lines by hand. It was, in a real sense, one of the earliest machines built specifically to automate the reading of time itself. But water clocks had their own hidden flaw. Water doesn't flow at exactly the same speed in every condition. Cold water moves slower. Warm water moves faster. In freezing climates, the water could stop moving entirely, freezing solid and stopping time altogether. Humans needed something that didn't care about temperature at all. One answer came from something that burned at a steady, predictable pace of its own. Fire, shaped into a very specific tool. The candle clock used evenly spaced marks along a candle's length. As it burned down, hour by hour, each past mark meant another hour gone. In China, a related idea used incense instead of wax, calibrated sticks or elaborate carved incense seals that burned along a fixed, known path. Some incense seals were pressed into an intricate maze-like groove, so a single stick of incense could smolder for many hours in a compact, decorative shape, instead of one long straight stick. Some incense clocks were even built with small threads holding metal balls above a bell. When the incense burned through a thread, the ball dropped, ringing out the hour on its own. For the first time, a clock didn't just show time. It could actually announce it, completely on its own. In England, King Alfred the Great is said to have used marked candles divided into sections to structure his entire day, reportedly protecting the flame from drafts inside a thin panel of horn, an early version of a lantern. Even a king, it turns out, needed exactly the same basic tool as anyone else to structure a day, just wrapped in a slightly nicer case. But fire-based clocks had a problem of their own. Wind, drafts, and rain could all interfere with an open flame. At sea, this problem became impossible to ignore. No sailor could rely on an open flame, or even flowing water, on a constantly rocking ship. So sailors turned to a completely sealed solution. Fine sand, falling steadily through a narrow neck between two glass bulbs. The hourglass didn't care about wind, rain, or rocking waves. Sand fell at the same rate no matter how rough the sea got. Ship crews flipped hourglasses on a strict rotating schedule to track work shifts, a system that quietly shaped the very idea of a sailor's watch. Here's the strange part. Despite how simple it looks, the hourglass is actually one of the later inventions in this entire story. Building one required surprisingly precise glassmaking, two evenly matched, perfectly sealed bulbs joined by a narrow neck, technology that simply didn't reliably exist until medieval Europe. So while sand itself had been sitting around for the entire span of human history, the tool to actually use it properly had to wait for glassmaking to catch up first. While Europe leaned on sand and wax, another part of the world was building something far more precise. In the Islamic world, the astrolabe became one of the most advanced timekeeping tools of the ancient and medieval era, using the position of stars and the sun to calculate precise time and direction. Mosques employed dedicated timekeepers, called muwaqqits, whose entire job was calculating the exact moments for each of the day's 5 prayers using instruments like this. In the 12th century, engineer Al-Jazari built extraordinary water-powered clocks, some shaped like castles, using elaborate mechanisms to mark the hours automatically with moving figures and sound. These weren't simple timekeeping tools anymore. They were genuine engineering achievements, centuries ahead of anything most of the world had ever built before. One of Al-Jazari's most famous creations, the elephant clock, combined a water-powered mechanism hidden inside a life-sized model elephant, with a Mahout figure on top striking a symbol automatically to mark each passing half hour. It combined engineering from Greece, Persia, India, and China all into a single working machine, a genuine symbol of how connected ancient timekeeping knowledge really was. Meanwhile in China, a similar leap was happening on an even larger scale. This wasn't even China's first attempt. Centuries earlier, in the 2nd century, astronomer Zhang Heng had already built a water-powered armillary sphere, using a steady water flow to rotate a model of the sky in sync with the real stars above. It was an early proof that flowing water could be trusted to drive something far more complex than a simple dripping clock. In the 11th century, engineer Su Song built an enormous astronomical clock tower, powered by a water wheel linked to an early escapement mechanism that regulated its movement with real precision. The tower featured moving figures that emerged automatically to mark the hours, along with a rotating armillary sphere for tracking the stars above. In many ways, this stood as one of the earliest true mechanical clocks in the world, centuries before anything similar appeared in Europe. In medieval Europe, for a long stretch of time, timekeeping wasn't really about hours or minutes at all. It was about bells. Monasteries rang bells at set points through the day and night, calling monks to prayer at fixed canonical hours, whether or not anyone could see the sun. These fixed prayer times even had their own names. hours like matins before dawn, vespers at dusk, dividing the entire day into a rhythm shared by the whole community, clock or no clock. This need for reliable, repeatable bell ringing quietly pushed European engineers towards something genuinely new, a fully mechanical clock. By the 13 and 1400s, a mechanism called the verge escapement allowed a set of falling weights to drive gears forward at a steady, controlled pace. These early clocks were mounted in church towers across European towns, often with just a single-hour hand, since minutes still weren't considered important enough to track. For the first time in human history, an entire town could check the same mechanical time, together, at a glance. Over the following centuries, these mechanisms kept shrinking, gaining a minute hand, then eventually becoming small enough to wear on a chain, and finally small enough to strap directly onto a wrist. Even the word clock traces back to this exact era, borrowed from an old word for bell, a quiet reminder that mechanical timekeeping and ringing bells were, for centuries, the exact same invention. Stop and compare these two realities for a second. An ancient priest, watching a specific cluster of stars rise, trained for years just to estimate which hour of the night it might be. Today, you glance at your wrist, or your phone, and know the exact second, without a single thought. The core need never actually changed across that entire span of time. Humans have always needed to know where they stand inside a day. What changed was every layer built to answer that need. A shadow on the ground, a drop of water, a burning line on a candle, falling sand, a rotating gear, and finally, a number glowing quietly on a screen. Maybe that's the real thread running through this story. Time itself never changed for a single moment. Humans just kept building better ways to make sure they were never lost inside it. If you found it interesting how humans measured something completely invisible using nothing but shadows, water, fire, and sand, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, a canoe sets out with no map, no compass, and no land in sight in any direction. The nearest island is thousands of kilometers away, hidden somewhere across open water. And yet, the people on that canoe will find it. Not by luck, by reading the ocean itself, like a language most of us have completely forgotten how to speak. So how did ancient humans actually navigate across oceans, deserts, and empty wilderness for thousands of years, with absolutely nothing electronic to guide them? The answer starts with the sky itself, the only truly reliable map available to everyone on Earth, every single night. Ancient navigators didn't just glance up at the stars. They memorized them, entire patterns, entire seasonal shifts, tracking which stars rose and set at which points on the horizon throughout the year. In Polynesia, this became an entire discipline, passed down for generations, known today as wayfinding. Navigators memorized what's called a star compass, dividing the horizon into distinct points marked by specific stars rising and setting in the same place, night after night. But stars alone weren't enough. Clouds roll in. Storms hide the sky for days at a time. So Polynesian navigators built a second, even stranger system, one that didn't rely on seeing anything at all. They learned to feel the ocean itself, specific swell patterns, deep, consistent waves generated by distant storms and steady trade winds, roll across the Pacific in predictable directions. Skilled navigators could lie down inside the hull of a canoe and feel these swells moving beneath the boat, reading direction through motion alone, sometimes even in complete darkness. Here's the part that sounds almost impossible. Some navigators could reportedly distinguish multiple overlapping swell patterns at once, cross-referencing wave direction against star position, holding an entire mental map of open ocean current with no instrument beyond their own body. And there was a third layer to this system too. Birds. Certain seabirds fly out to sea each morning to fish and return to land each evening. Spotting the right species, flying in the right direction at the right time of day, could mean land was closer than it looked, sometimes tens of kilometers closer than the horizon suggested. Stars, swells, and birds, three completely different signals, cross-checked against each other, constantly, for a journey that could last weeks without ever seeing land. Meanwhile, in a completely different environment, a different culture was solving the exact same core problem in an entirely different way. In the Arctic, Inuit travelers faced a landscape that looked almost featureless to outsiders, endless white snow stretching in every direction. But it wasn't featureless to them at all. Wind consistently sculpts snow into long, hardened ridges called sastrugi, all oriented in the same general direction across huge stretches of terrain. Experienced travelers could read these ridges by sight, or even by touch in low visibility, using them like a compass carved directly into the ground itself. Two completely different environments, ocean and ice, and two completely different navigation systems, both built entirely from patterns nature had already been repeating for centuries. Deserts presented their own version of the exact same problem, an ocean of sand instead of water, where landmarks shifted overnight and a single wrong turn could mean days without water. Bedouin travelers crossing the Arabian and Sahara deserts relied on an equally layered system. stars still mattered enormously at night. But by day, navigators read the direction of prevailing winds baked directly into the shape of sand dunes, along with subtler cues like the growth patterns of sparse desert vegetation, which often leaned or clustered based on consistent local wind and moisture patterns. Even the animals became part of the system. Experienced camel drivers trusted their animals to instinctively sense the direction of distant water sources, sometimes hours before any human could detect a single sign of it. What about travel across land, where there was no consistent wind pattern, no reliable swell, nothing quite so rhythmic to lean on? In Australia, Aboriginal communities developed something remarkable: song lines, intricate oral traditions encoding travel routes across vast stretches of desert into song, story, and ceremony. Specific landmarks, water sources, and directions were woven directly into lyrics and narrative structure, meaning a song wasn't just entertainment. It was, quite literally, a map you could sing your way across the continent with. Lose the physical trail, and the story itself could still guide you home. Long before any instrument could reveal a ship's exact position, sailors relied on a method that was really just careful arithmetic: dead reckoning. Starting from a known position, a navigator tracked speed, direction, and elapsed time to estimate roughly where the ship should now be. Speed itself was measured with a surprisingly simple tool: a knotted rope tied to a floating piece of wood, tossed overboard and let out over a fixed amount of time, counting how many knots passed through a sailor's hands. That method is the direct origin of the word we still use today to measure a ship's speed: knots. It worked, but only roughly. Every small error in estimated speed or direction compounded over the length of a voyage, and after weeks at sea, a ship's dead-reckoned position could drift dangerously far from its true location, sometimes without anyone realizing it until land, or rocks, appeared without warning. Now here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, because for a long time, all of these systems still shared the same fundamental weakness: they only worked if you already knew the region. A Polynesian navigator's swell knowledge meant almost nothing in the Arctic. Songlines meant nothing across open ocean. Every system was hyperlocal, built from years, sometimes generations, of accumulated local knowledge. Something more universal was needed, something that could work almost anywhere on Earth, for someone who had never set foot there before. And the first real answer to that came from an unlikely source: Iraq. Norse sailors, venturing into the North Atlantic where thick cloud cover could hide the sun for days, are believed to have used a mineral called Iceland spar, a form of calcite that splits sunlight in a very specific way. Even under overcast skies, this crystal could reveal the sun's position through faint polarization patterns invisible to the naked eye alone. Sagas describe this tool as a sunstone. For a long time, historians dismissed it as legend. Then modern experiments confirmed the physics actually works, well enough to locate the sun's position within a few degrees, even through heavy cloud cover. A simple rock, held up to a gray, sunless sky, quietly solving a problem that would otherwise have stranded a ship in open, freezing water. But even the sunstone had limits. It told you a direction. It didn't tell you where, exactly, you actually were. The next breakthrough came from a discovery that had nothing to do with sailing at all. In ancient China, it was noticed that a particular naturally magnetized mineral, lodestone, would always align itself in the same direction when allowed to move freely, whether floating on water or balanced delicately on a pivot. By the time this observation evolved into the magnetic compass, sailors finally had something no star chart or swell pattern could offer: a completely reliable direction. Day or night, clear sky or thick fog, anywhere on the planet. It sounds simple now. At the time, it was genuinely revolutionary. For the first time, direction itself had been separated from the sky entirely, extracted, and placed directly into a sailor's hand. Combined with dead reckoning, the compass eventually gave rise to something else new: the Portolan chart. Detailed coastal maps crisscrossed with straight compass lines called rum lines, letting sailors plot a course directly between ports with a level of precision no star chart alone could offer. But even the finest Portolan chart could only describe what earlier sailors had already recorded. It still couldn't tell a captain, in the middle of open, uncharted ocean, exactly where they currently stood. But a compass could only tell you which way was north. It still couldn't tell you exactly where you were on a vast, largely unmapped ocean. And this gap led to one of the deadliest problems in the entire history of navigation, one that took centuries, and cost thousands of lives, to actually solve. Sailors could calculate latitude, their position north or south, relatively accurately, using tools like the astrolabe and later the sextant to measure the angle of the sun or specific stars above the horizon. But longitude, position east or west, remained essentially a guessing game for centuries. Ships regularly missed their destinations by hundreds of kilometers. Some ran straight into rocks they never saw coming, in disasters that killed entire crews at once. The problem, it turned out, wasn't really about space at all. It was about time. Longitude could theoretically be calculated by comparing local time, measured by the sun's position, against the exact time back at a fixed reference point, like a home port. Every hour of difference represented a precise, calculable distance traveled east or west. The problem was brutally simple. No clock of the era could keep accurate time at sea, rocked constantly by waves, exposed to swinging temperature changes in salty, humid air that threw off delicate mechanisms within days. In the 1700s, after a catastrophic naval disaster caused directly by a longitude miscalculation, the British government offered an enormous cash reward to anyone who could solve the problem for good. An English carpenter and self-taught clockmaker named John Harrison spent decades obsessively refining a solution, eventually building marine chronometers precise and stable enough to keep reliable time through months at sea, through storms, through wildly shifting temperatures, without ever losing more than a few seconds. For the first time in human history, a ship's crew could know their exact location on the open ocean. No landmarks, no stars, no luck required, just an incredibly precise, ticking machine locked safely below deck. Land travel had its own version of this same evolution. The Roman Empire built an enormous network of roads stretching across 3 continents, marked at regular intervals with carved milestones showing exact distances to the nearest major city. For the first time, a traveler on land didn't need local knowledge, ancestral stories, or years of experience reading the terrain. They just needed to find the road, and read the stone. Stop and compare these two realities for a second. A Polynesian navigator, lying inside the hull of a canoe in complete darkness, feeling the ocean itself to know which direction to steer. Today, a single glance at a small glowing screen in your pocket instantly reveals your exact position, calculated by satellites orbiting far above the Earth, using signals precise enough to place you within a few meters, anywhere on the planet. The core problem never actually changed across that entire span of history. Humans have always needed to know exactly where they are, and exactly which way to go next. What changed was every layer built to answer that need. Memorized stars, ocean swells read by touch alone, wind-carved ridges in snow, songs that doubled as maps, a crystal that revealed a hidden sun, a stone that always pointed north, and finally, a machine precise enough to turn time itself into a location. Maybe that's the real thread hiding underneath this entire story. Humans were never actually lost. Not really. We just hadn't yet learned how to properly listen to everything the world was already trying to tell us. If you found it interesting how humans navigated entire oceans and deserts using nothing but stars, waves, and their own memory, watch the next video, where we trace how humans went from silence to spoken language. It's the year 1200, inside a stone monastery in the dead of night. A monk rises from his bed, alone, in near total darkness, at the exact same hour he has risen every night for decades. No mechanical device tells him it's time. No bell has rung yet. And yet, night after night, for years on end, he never oversleeps. So how does a person, with nothing but their own body, wake up at the same precise hour, alone, in the dark, decade after decade? Long before humans ever agreed on what on time even meant, they still needed to wake up at the right moment, for prayer, for hunting, for guarding a fire that couldn't be allowed to die. And it turns out, the very first alarm clock wasn't built by anyone at all. It was already running inside every human body on Earth. Think of it like 2 invisible clocks ticking inside you at once. One is your body's internal sense of day and night, quietly tracking light and darkness and nudging you towards sleep as evening falls, then easing you awake again as morning approaches, on a rhythm that repeats roughly every 24 hours. The other is more like a slowly filling hourglass. The longer you stay awake, the more your need for sleep builds up, until it finally tips you into rest, then empties out again once you've slept enough. Together, these two systems can do something that sounds almost impossible today: wake a person at nearly the same hour, night after night, with zero outside help. Monks, farmers, and hunters relying on this alone weren't guessing. Their bodies had simply been trained, through repetition, to expect the exact same wake-up call every single day, but biology alone couldn't be trusted for anything precise, and precision, eventually, became necessary. So humans built their first artificial solution, and it came from somewhere unexpected: water. In both ancient Egypt and Greece, water clocks weren't only used to measure the hours. Some were cleverly rigged as genuine wake-up devices. The philosopher Plato is said to have used a modified water clock at his academy, one built so that as water reached a certain level overnight, it triggered a rush of air through a tube, producing a loud whistling sound right at the hour he wanted to rise. It wasn't just a clock anymore. It was, quite possibly, the world's first mechanical alarm. Fire offered its own version of the same idea. In parts of ancient China, calibrated incense sticks were built with small threads suspended above a bell, each thread holding up a metal ball. As the incense burned down at a steady, known pace, it would eventually burn through the thread, and the ball would drop, striking the bell below completely on its own. No person needed to watch the flame all night. The fire was, in effect, watching the clock for them. And then there's a stranger solution, one worth pausing on for just a moment because of how unusual it is. In parts of 19th century China, some people reportedly wedged a lit stick of incense between their toes before sleeping, time to burn down and reach the skin at the exact hour they needed to wake. Uncomfortable, unforgettable, and apparently effective. It's a strange little footnote in this story, but it makes one thing obvious. If ordinary people were improvising with pain and fire just to wake up on their own, how did entire institutions manage to wake up together every single night, for centuries, without fail? This is where the monks come back into the story. Picture a long, freezing stone corridor, lit by nothing but a single candle, rows of narrow cells on either side, each holding a sleeping monk. Under the rule of Saint Benedict, monasteries operated on a strict nightly schedule, built around a service called vigils, or matins, held deep in the dark hours before dawn. Missing it wasn't a small mistake. It was treated as a genuine spiritual failure. The medieval chronicler Raoul Glaber even recorded his own private temptation to simply stay in bed rather than rise for the freezing walk to the chapel, a small, very human detail buried inside a system built entirely around discipline. Interestingly, some historians believe this same environment reinforced a pattern called segmented sleep, a first sleep and a second sleep, with a deliberate waking period carved out in between, almost custom-built for a schedule like this. But bells only worked if someone was already awake to ring them. So who exactly was waking up before everyone else, night after night, to make sure the rest of the community never had to? Long before any monastery bell rang, an even older system had already solved this same problem. Someone had to stay awake so that everyone else could safely sleep. Picture a Roman military camp at midnight, torches guttering along the perimeter, armored soldiers pacing slowly past rows of sleeping tents. Roman camps operated on strict night watch rotations, called the Vigiliae, dividing the night into fixed shifts so soldiers could take turns standing guard while others rested. In ancient Egypt, temple guards maintained a continuous, round-the-clock presence over sacred sites, ensuring the watch never actually stopped, day or night. And in medieval towns, city watchmen walked the streets through the darkest hours, lantern in hand, sometimes literally calling out the hour as they passed beneath shuttered windows, turning themselves into a walking, talking clock for anyone still awake to hear. These watchmen were the ones keeping time in the dark. But eventually, simply watching wasn't enough anymore. Someone had to actually walk up to a person's door and wake them. And that's exactly when the watcher became something new entirely. Town criers had already been calling out news and the hour in public squares. Church bell ringers had long marked the hours for entire towns at once. But in industrial-era Britain, a much more personal version of this job appeared, the knocker-upper, someone paid to walk a fixed route every morning, tapping on specific windows with a long stick, or firing dried peas through a pea shooter at upper-floor glass, until the person inside woke up. Astonishingly, this job didn't disappear with the Industrial Revolution. It survived, in some towns, all the way into the 1970s. Which raises an almost comical question. If people were being paid, professionally, to wake up other people, what happened when even the knocker-upper needed someone to wake them? Underneath all of this was something bigger than convenience. In many communities, waking on time wasn't just practical, it was treated as a moral duty. Oversleeping could mean missing prayer, missing a shift, missing your turn on watch, and by extension, letting down the people relying on you. Waking up on time was never just a personal habit. It was, quite literally, a promise kept to everyone around you, and all of these threads, the biological, the hydraulic, the burning thread and falling ball, the painful improvisation, the watchman, the crier, the knocker-upper, the moral weight of simply not being late, all of it eventually converges on one moment. Around the year 1200, European monasteries began adopting early mechanical clock mechanisms, using a verge escapement to regulate falling weights with genuine precision, specifically to trigger the bells that woke an entire community at the exact same hour, automatically, without a single person standing watch. It wasn't just a clock. It was, in every meaningful sense, the world's first true mechanical alarm. For thousands of years, waking up on time meant trusting someone else to carry that weight for you, a monk listening for a bell in the dark, a soldier pacing the cold so his camp could sleep, a stranger tapping on glass before dawn. Now that trust has been handed to a small machine on a nightstand. But strip away the beep, and it's still the exact same ancient promise, whispered forward through every century since that first monk rose alone in the dark. Someone, or something, is watching the night, so you never have to face the morning unready. Ancient Egypt, 4,000 years ago. A young woman wakes to find blood on her linens for the first time. There are no pads waiting in a cabinet. No pharmacy down the street. No supermarket shelf lined with boxes. Just her own hands, and whatever the world around her has to offer. So what does she actually do? The answer might completely change what you think you know about ancient women. Because to understand it, we first have to understand something surprising about how often a moment like this even happened. Historian Shara Vostral has pointed out something most people never consider. Earlier, puberty didn't exist the way it does now. Pregnancies came more frequently, and long stretches of breastfeeding naturally suppressed ovulation for months, sometimes years, at a time. Add it all up across a lifetime, and ancient women likely menstruated dramatically fewer times than women do today. So here's the question worth sitting with. If periods happen less often, does that mean ancient women were less prepared for them when they came? Or does it reveal something surprisingly advanced about exactly how they managed it? Menstruation is one of the most universal experiences in human history. Every culture, every era, every continent. And yet it's also one of the least documented. Not because it didn't matter. Because of what it was made of. Cloth decomposes. Moss disintegrates. Plant fiber and papyrus, buried in soil or exposed to moisture, simply don't survive the way stone tools or pottery do. Which means historians piecing this story together aren't just reading ancient artifacts off a shelf. They're reconstructing an invisible history, using scattered written records, environmental context, and educated inference to fill in gaps that direct evidence simply can't. So with almost nothing physical left behind, how do we actually know anything about what ancient women used? We start with the earliest clues, and they don't come from objects at all. They come from environment. Historians reconstructing Stone Age practices point to leather, along with linen wrapped around moss or absorbent sand, as plausible early solutions. It's important to be clear about what this actually is. Not confirmed fact. Informed inference, built from what materials were locally available and durable enough to shape into something usable. No preserved Stone Age pad has ever been found, and given how organic material breaks down over tens of thousands of years, it's unlikely one ever will. This part of the story will always live in reconstruction, not certainty. But once civilizations began writing things down, the fog starts to lift. And one civilization in particular left behind something remarkably specific. Ancient Egypt approached menstruation with a strange, striking combination, precision and reverence, sitting side by side. Picture papyrus, the same versatile plant material Egyptians used for paper, boats, and rope, being softened, rolled, and shaped into an absorbent tampon-like device. Alongside it, soft linen, folded and worn externally, offering a gentler, more comfortable option depending on need. This wasn't crude improvisation. It was, functionally, engineering. But Egypt didn't stop at the practical. Menstrual blood carried spiritual weight, tied directly to Hathor, the goddess associated with fertility, motherhood, and the feminine body itself. In a culture where nearly everything physical was mirrored by something sacred, a woman's period wasn't hidden away in shame. It sat inside a much larger story about the body, the divine, and creation, which raises an interesting contrast. If the Egyptians treated menstruation as something sacred, how did the next great civilization, one obsessed with anatomy, medicine, and the mechanics of the human body, choose to approach it instead? Around the 5th century BCE, the Greek physician Hippocrates, a name still attached to medical ethics today, recorded something that sounds almost identical to a product sitting in your bathroom cabinet right now. Lint, wrapped carefully around a small piece of wood. A tampon, in nearly every functional sense, documented in writing over 2,000 years ago. The Romans, building on ideas moving through the Mediterranean world, are believed to have used wool and reed-based plant fibers as absorbent material, softened and shaped for the same essential purpose. Which means the core idea behind the modern tampon isn't a 20th century invention at all. It's over 2,400 years old. So if the concept existed that early, fully documented, functionally sound, why did it take nearly 2,000 years for anything to meaningfully improve on it? While Greece and Rome were refining their approach, entirely separate cultures, with zero contact with each other or with the Mediterranean world, were solving the exact same problem in their own way, using whatever their environment provided. In Japan, women used paper, layered and shaped into something absorbent, echoing a papermaking tradition that ran deep through the culture. And despite being separated by entire oceans, with no trade routes, no shared language, and no possible way to compare notes, women on the other side of the world were arriving at strikingly similar answers. Across parts of Native American communities, moss and buffalo skin served the same essential purpose, materials chosen for softness and availability. In equatorial Africa, grass mats and rolled grass fibers were shaped into functional, reusable solutions. Different continents. Different materials. Completely independent innovation. And yet, at the core, the same basic engineering problem, solved again and again, by women who had never spoken to each other, using nothing but observation and necessity. These were resourceful, genuinely practical solutions. So why did the next chapter in this story make things dramatically worse instead of better? Something shifts in medieval Europe. Not the materials, at first. The attitude around them. Washable cloth rags remain the dominant method, sometimes supplemented with absorbent bog moss in wetter regions. Functionally, not far removed from what came before. But layered on top of the practical reality was something new and corrosive. Menstrual blood, once tied to fertility and the sacred in cultures like Egypt, was now increasingly framed through religious and superstitious belief as something impure. Something to be concealed. Something almost dangerous. Picture a woman in a cold stone home, quietly washing cloth rags by candlelight, not because the method had failed her, but because being seen doing it had suddenly become something to fear. With shame now wrapped tightly around something completely natural, how did women adapt? What did they build in secret, once the world stopped letting them manage this openly? As stigma deepened, so did the need for discretion. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, cotton and flannel became common, folded and tucked directly into undergarments, chosen specifically because they could be worn, hidden, and disposed of quietly, without ever needing to be discussed. Then came a small but telling innovation, the rubber apron, worn beneath clothing to prevent leaks from reaching outer garments in public. Crude by any modern standard. But revealing all the same. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for concealment, engineering built specifically around the fear of being found out. These were still private, homemade fixes, whispered about, never sold, never spoken of openly. So what finally dragged period care out of the shadows and turned it into something manufactured, marketed, and sold? The answer starts somewhere completely unrelated to menstruation at all. In 1896, a product called Lister's towels hit the market, originally designed to manage postpartum bleeding after childbirth. But women quickly recognized its broader use, quietly adapting it for menstrual care. It became, in effect, the first commercially sold disposable pad, even though that was never its original intention. Then came the First World War, and with it, an accidental discovery that would reshape the entire industry. Picture a field hospital somewhere near the front lines. Rows of cots stretching further than any single lantern can light. Nurses moving from bed to bed, hour after hour, changing bandages soaked through with blood, again and again, faster than clean linen can keep up. The wounded keep arriving. The bandages keep running out. And somewhere in that exhausting, relentless rhythm, someone notices something strange. The cellulose material packed into these surgical dressings is pulling in far more blood than ordinary cotton ever could, and holding it, without falling apart. Military nurses treating wounded soldiers noticed something unexpected about that cellulose material. It absorbed blood significantly better than cotton ever had. Nurses, already managing their own periods under brutal wartime conditions, began quietly repurposing leftover surgical bandaging for menstrual use, the same material saving soldiers' lives now folded discreetly into their own underclothes. That single wartime observation led directly to Kotex, one of the very first true mass-market disposable pads, born not from a boardroom, but from a battlefield hospital, in the middle of one of the deadliest wars in human history. A product built to save soldiers' lives accidentally solved a problem women had been managing quietly for thousands of years, and it would go on to change how women worked, traveled, and moved through public life in ways no one back in that field hospital could have predicted. Now step back and look at the entire shape of this story at once. Egyptian papyrus, folded with precision. Hippocrates lint, wrapped tightly around wood. Roman wool. Japanese paper. Moss and buffalo skin across Native American communities. Grass fiber in equatorial Africa. Medieval cloth, washed in secrecy. Cotton hidden beneath clothing. A rubber apron built purely to avoid detection. Surgical bandaging, repurposed on a battlefield. None of this was random. Every single one of these solutions was engineering, built and refined by women, using precisely what their world made available, generation after generation, culture after culture, almost never with any credit attached. The truth is, nobody invented period care in the 20th century. What actually happened is that an industry finally caught up to knowledge women had already been perfecting for thousands of years. History often remembers the companies that sold the product. Kotex. The brand name. The box on the shelf. It rarely remembers the woman kneeling by a river 4,000 years ago, folding papyrus with her own hands, solving this exact problem long before any of those companies ever existed. For thousands of years, women weren't waiting for someone to invent a solution. They already had one, made from papyrus, wool, moss, and cloth, carried quietly from mother to daughter, era to era, without a single patent, without a single headline. The only thing that ever really changed was who finally started paying attention. Somewhere in a research lab, a scientist is looking at a genetic mutation in an insect and using it to answer a question about you. Not about the insect itself, about humans. About something we did over 80,000 years ago, something so ordinary today that we never think twice about it. This tiny genetic clue might completely change what you think you know about the origins of clothing. Body lice, the kind that live specifically in clothing rather than hair, genetically split off from head lice somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. That number matters enormously, because body lice cannot survive without fabric to live in. No clothing, no body lice. Which means this single insect, still crawling around today, is one of our clearest biological signatures for exactly when humans started covering their bodies. If insects are our best evidence for when clothing began, what were early humans actually wearing that far back? And how do we know anything at all when the clothes themselves vanished from the earth so long ago? Clothing might be one of the oldest technologies humanity has ever developed, and also one of the hardest to actually study. Fur rots. Plant fiber disintegrates, leather breaks down into the soil within centuries, not millennia. Which means archaeologists can almost never hold the actual garment in their hands. Instead, they read the story sideways, through tools left behind, through cut marks scratched into ancient bone, and through the rare, almost accidental discovery that somehow survived against impossible odds. So if the clothing itself is gone, what tools were early humans actually using to make it in the first place? In 2021, researchers working in a cave in Morocco uncovered something remarkable: 62 specialized bone tools, dated to somewhere between 90,000 and 120,000 years old, smoothed and shaped specifically for scraping and softening hide. Beside them, something even more telling: the bones of carnivores, foxes, jackals, wildcats, marked not with the rough cuts of butchery, but with precise, deliberate skinning marks. These tools prove humans were making clothing this far back. But here's the detail that should stop you. Why skin foxes and jackals specifically, animals nobody was eating for dinner? The most likely answer is fur itself, and specifically its quality. Certain carnivores carry dense, insulating pelts, exactly the kind of material you'd want between your body and a brutal ice age wind. These weren't hunting trophies. They were raw material, chosen deliberately for what their skin could become. And fur, it turns out, may be one of the oldest clothing materials humans have ever relied on. Some evidence points to fur use stretching back over 120,000 years, while hide processing for clothing and shelter reaches even further, to roughly 400,000 years ago, deep into the Paleolithic. Long before our own species even existed in its current form, Neanderthals were already scraping, softening, and shaping animal hide into wearable protection against the cold. Picture it. A Neanderthal crouched beside a fire, working a stiff, frozen hide back and forth with a stone scraper, hour after hour, turning something stiff and lifeless into something that could actually keep a body alive through winter. This wasn't decoration. This was survival, hard won, one hide at a time. If Neanderthals were already wearing fur, what changed when a different kind of human, one that would eventually replace them entirely, arrived on the same frozen landscape? Around 40,000 years ago, Cro-Magnon humans brought something new to the process: precision. Using finely shaped bone needles and awls, they moved beyond simple wraps and drapes into something closer to true tailoring: fitted pants, shirts, hoods, and boots, cut and stitched specifically to the shape of the human body. One historian has compared the sophistication of this early tailoring to the construction quality of modern Arctic clothing, an almost unbelievable claim for something made entirely from stone tools and animal hide. This wasn't just about staying warm anymore. It was engineering, refined generation after generation, until a needle and a scrap of hide could produce something built specifically to move, bend, and survive alongside its owner. But needles and hides can only tell us so much. What about color? What about style? Is there any evidence that humans, this early in our story, actually cared about how they looked? In a cave in the Republic of Georgia, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary: flax fibers dyed in shades of black, gray, turquoise, and pink, dated to roughly 36,000 BCE. This is the earliest known evidence of textile fiber use on record, and it arrives with a detail almost nobody expects. These fibers were dyed, deliberately colored, tens of thousands of years before anyone had woven a single piece of actual cloth. Which means somewhere in that impossibly distant past, a human being wasn't just solving a survival problem. They were making a choice about color. About how something should look, not just how it should function. If humans were dyeing fiber this early, when did they finally figure out how to weave those fibers into something wearable? The answer comes from an unlikely source: not cloth itself, but clay. At Dolny Vestinus in the modern-day Czech Republic, archaeologists found something the ancient world left behind almost by accident: faint impressions of woven textiles, basketry, and knotted netting, pressed into soft clay roughly 27,000 years ago and preserved as that clay hardened over time. The fabric itself is long gone. Its exact shape, texture, and weave pattern survived anyway, fossilized in negative space. Around this same period, roughly 25,000 years ago, so-called Venus figurines began appearing across Western and Eastern Europe, carved with unmistakable detail: basket-woven hats, belts, and what appears to be a string skirt wrapped around the hips. This is art functioning as evidence, a frozen snapshot of exactly what humans were choosing to wear, deliberately carved by someone who wanted this recorded. Clothing had officially evolved from raw animal hide into woven, constructed fiber. But this raises a much bigger question. Once basic warmth wasn't the only concern anymore, why did people keep wearing clothes at all? This is where the story gets genuinely complicated, because historians don't fully agree. Some point to adornment and status, clothing as a way to visually announce identity, achievement, or rank within a group, the same impulse that would eventually put leopard skins on Egyptian priests and royalty as a mark of power. Others point toward an even more debated theory, first proposed by early 20th century anthropologists, suggesting clothing may have played a role in sexual signaling and attraction. It's important to be clear here. These are competing academic theories, actively debated, not settled fact. Nobody can prove, with certainty, exactly why a specific ancient human chose to wear what they wore. And just when you think you've found a pattern, one archaeological case complicates every single theory at once: a group of people who had clothing, and then simply chose to give it up. Archaeological evidence shows that Aboriginal Tasmanians used hide scrapers and bone awls for garment making somewhere between 32,000 and 12,000 years ago. Then, strikingly, that evidence disappears from the archaeological record entirely. The tools stop showing up. The technology, by all appearances, was simply abandoned. If a population could survive, generation after generation, through genuinely harsh conditions without clothing they had once relied on, what does that tell us about everything we assumed clothing was actually for? Maybe it was never one single, universal answer. Maybe different humans, in different environments, needed different things from the exact same invention. Now bring every piece of this story together: the lice DNA whispering a date scientists could never have found any other way, the Moroccan bone tools and their carefully skinned carnivores, Neanderthals hunched over hides beside ancient fires, Cro-Magnon needles stitching fitted boots and hoods, dyed flax fibers colored purely by choice, woven impressions pressed into hardening clay, carved figurines wearing string skirts, and an entire population that simply walked away from the whole idea. All of it converges, remarkably, in a single frozen body, Discovered in 1991, high in the Alps, Otzi the Iceman, roughly 5,300 years old, wearing the most complete prehistoric outfit ever recovered. Goat hide leggings. A bearskin hat. A cloak woven from grass. Shoes stuffed with hay for insulation. Materials pulled from 6 different animal species, and fibers sourced from 17 different types of tree. Every single material Otzi wore had already existed in human hands for tens of thousands of years before he was even born. He wasn't wearing something new. He was wearing something perfected, the final, polished result of an idea humans had been quietly refining since long before anyone thought to write a single word down. Long before we had writing, cities, or even language as we know it, humans were already solving one of our oldest problems, not just how to survive the world, but how to face it dressed.